The True You podcast is all about tapping into the resources of the true you.
Problem with trying to be someone else who you think you need to be to get by and get more is that you have to try harder than you need to in life.
And that's exhausting because you've lost access to resources like creativity, clarity, compassion, and confidence.
We recognize it seems odd to discover that you aren't being the true you, but there's an empowering homecoming that you can feel when you rest back into your authentic self, the true you. Welcome, everybody, to the True You podcast with my guest host, Bill Tierney, who is a IFS coach and results-oriented coach, and with me, Martin Kettelhut, executive leadership coach. And this is just our second episode of this new podcast. And our topic for today is a basic one, but a very important one with a lot of implications. We want to talk about the difference between the different parts of us, which we often talk about and relate to, and how to be with them and empower them and put them to bed, but also the difference between those parts and the true you. Right? Because the underlying claim is that there is a true you that can comfort or tend to, in some way, these parts. But what's the difference between it and just another part? So I know that this is basic distinction in IFS. What is the IFS position on this question?
I'm going to need to answer what my position is rather than what the IFS position is, because it seems like I view it maybe slightly differently than others do. Maybe not. Maybe others see it as I do. So let me just speak from how I understand it, and then let those who are new to IFS do their own research and determine for themselves what that difference is. So in the IFS model, the true you is referred to as self with a capital S. And then parts are not self, and self is not a part. And this is really, while it might feel like it's splitting hairs to some, I think this is a really important distinction. I don't personally believe that there is a separate self, that I am, and then in contrast, that I don't have parts that I'm not. Parts are parts of me. So in that way, they are me. And self, I see as potential in every single part that I have.
Mm-hmm.
Not as a separate energy or entity within me. Mm-hmm. The true core me self can only be expressed through my parts. That's my personal belief, and other IFS practitioners may differ on that. But to the point that you're bringing up about what's the difference between the true you and the parts of you, now we can start breaking that down, I believe. I like to think, and I got this from Bonnie Weiss, who created the Self-Therapy Workbook. Jay Early created a series of books that are called Self-Therapy, and she created the Self-Therapy Workbook, Bonnie Weiss did. And in that book, she has these wonderful illustrations that helped me early on when I was first beginning to trying to wrap my mind around what is the internal family systems model and how does it work? And apparently I'm a visual learner because I really enjoyed these illustrations that she has in her workbook. And I think I've talked about this before in the leadership coaching podcast. But if you didn't see that, if you haven't seen her book, or if you didn't see that episode of the podcast where I believe we actually showed it on the screen, imagine there is just a chair, a cushioned chair, and standing and stomping in that chair is a young child. the chair represents the seat of consciousness, and the young tantruming child represents a part that has become activated by some circumstance in life. And the thing that Bonnie is trying to point out with this illustration is that when an activated part that's still reacting to an unresolved, incomplete past, it has taken over our consciousness, then we think like that part. That might be a 2-year-old tantruming part of me that influences how I think, influences the emotions I experience, influences what I might be tempted to do or say, and in fact, even what I do or say under the influence of that part, if I'm not consciously aware that that's what's happening. Being consciously aware that that's what's happening is the beginning of bringing self-energy, or the true you, into the room with that tantruming child. So her illustrations go on. If you look at that first illustration, that tantruming child is stomping in that chair. Well, there's just behind the chair is a young woman, a young adult woman. Looks like she's probably in her 20s. And in the next illustration, the child is tantruming still, but not in the chair. Now the young woman is sitting in the chair. In other words, she has regained the seat of consciousness. And from her self-led, true you perspective, she's able to be detached from, observe, and be with the tantruming child part of herself. The child's not running her consciousness, not running her perspective, thoughts, feelings, or behavior. She's actually able to tend to that part of herself. I'm going to stop talking for a minute. As you're listening, how does that illustration work for you as I describe it that way?
Well, the question that it raises for me is about that seat.
Yes.
Right? It seems like we need that seat is an important part of the illustration. And yes, we want her to sit in it, but it's a container. And that for me is very important in my understanding of the true me, that there is this loving, this, like the big loving easy chair that any part can come and sit in and, be a part of the self, or realize the self, itself as self, right? And that seems like a key piece, because if it's just all these different parts have some potential, well, then that potential is going to be different with each of the parts.
That's right.
So that chair is the central place. And so I think that what's important, and you said this, is that it's not separate. Like, it is the place. It is the space. Maybe the self is just space in which, a loving space in which self lives, right? And I think that for me, that's a key piece. It's not separate, but it is distinct. It is different. It's not separate, but it is different from the parts.
I see it slightly differently than the way you just described. The seat represents consciousness. And consciousness is neutral. So it's neither loving or hateful. It's not, it doesn't have judgments. It's not impressed. It doesn't even have resources other than, as you say, a space that would be represented by the chair,
Right.
where the focus of consciousness can be pointed and collects data, let's just say, or information based on feedback from the internal and external worlds. So whoever's sitting in that seat, when I say the potential of self in a part, whatever part is sitting in that seat, what determines whether or not they're self-led is not the seat itself, but whether that part, let's say it this way, is acclimated to the present moment or the past. to the present, where through its eyes, through the eyes of this particular part that's sitting in the seat of consciousness, what's reflected back accurately portrays reality as it's unfolding in this moment, compared to what the part sees through its eyes, reflecting back a distorted sense of what's happening because it's still seeing through the lens of the past.
Well, one of the things that suggests to me as I think about what that, what and feel into what that would mean, it feels kind of like the universe, right? The universe is that neutral place where all of these things happen,
Right.
compassionate things and cruel things. They're all part of the universe, like, glorious things and terrible things are all contained in the universe. And so that would suggest that the self is the universe, like when we could really contain it all. And that raises a question for me then, like, is there a kind of love that is just not opposed to, not the opposite of hate? Because we want the, like you said, the self contains both, right? There are parts that are hateful and parts that are loving. But then and I'm just going to say it outright, I want to think that the universe itself, the self, is super loving. Like it's loving in that it contains lovely things and hateful things, but that there's this higher order kind of love. And this is the kind of love that gets talked about in most spiritual, that's where I'm coming from, most spiritual schools of thought. It's there that, God sends floods and hurricanes as well as, beautiful flowers and rainbows. All of it is the self. And so perhaps what I'm learning is that I should not associate God with the self.
I don't know. So let's simplify it back down to what I understand through the IFS model, which is really practical, and attaching God to self can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people.
Yes.
Think about those that have experienced religious trauma. If we attach God to self, and that religious trauma still is unresolved and unhealed, now self takes on a completely different idea than the self of someone like you who
but
doesn't
as
seem
you
to have that.
But as you put it, that is a part. It's traumatized. So that's not the self.
Well, now you're speaking as if part and self are separate, and that's what I'm telling you is that I don't believe there is a
No,
separation.
I'm not saying they're separate. I'm just saying that they're distinct, right? Because
that is the argument. That's the argument that I get into with the people that practice IFS often is that there's a distinct difference between self and a part.
well, I mean, just to go back and maybe put it in a different way, it seems to me that would leave us with no seat. There would just be this part's potential and this part's potential and that part's potential, but no seat.
I guess I'm not tracking why you would draw that conclusion.
Because that's the way I thought maybe I misunderstood the way you were saying it, but that's what I understood you to say.
Okay. Well, let's go back to how do you distinguish between a part that's self-led and a part that's burden-led. Now that's really the distinction I believe that matters. What I say to my clients, and this is the way I think about it for myself as well, is that we all need our parts to survive, to even operate in the physical plane. Without my parts, I wouldn't know my name, my birthday, or where I lived. I wouldn't remember to go to the grocery store. I wouldn't know whose clothes I was putting on. My parts help me operate if I put clothes on at all, operate in the material plane.
Mhm.
I believe that that self energy is spiritual in nature. You can't open somebody up and find self energy anywhere. You can't actually. I don't think. Maybe somebody's figured out how to do this yet, but I don't think there's a way to measure self energy. But I can feel it. I
Yeah,
can
well, that's how we
feel.
measure it. You feel it.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Right. Right. Yeah, so maybe there's actually a way to measure it scientifically as well. But yeah, I can feel the difference between
Mhm.
being self-led and being led by a part that is concerned and worried about what's going on in my life in this present moment.
Mhm. Mhm.
I'm not saying there aren't times to be concerned and worried. There are actual threats that take place, and we need to be able to respond to them. But burden parts that are still acting from the motivation to solve a problem that actually no longer exists, something that happened 20, 50 years ago. Those are the parts that, when they sit in that seat of consciousness, provide a distorted lens and have us reacting to current life as if
Cool.
it's still the past.
That's great. Yeah, no, the distinction between what that feels like inside when we know we're self-led versus led by an incomplete part.
Mm-hmm.
That is clear to me. And what I'm pointing to is a further distinction, which is that between being self-led and being the lead.
Say more. I'm not tracking as well as I'd like to be. To be the difference between being self-led and being the lead.
Yeah, leading.
And leading. Being self-led and leading.
Mhm. Yeah.
I see. Would you like to learn more about how the internal family systems model can help you to heal from your past and thrive? I use the IFS model with my coaching clients to do just this. If you think coaching with the IFS model could help, check out my website, billtierneycoaching.com. Now, back to the show.
Yeah, there's I have that experience where it's kind of like the universe or intuition or something from outside and who I'm being are one in that moment. And I'm leading. I'm not just led by self, but I am leading. And that feels different from being led by something, right? And so that is the self that the experience of which I've had, and I'm questioning if that's different. That's like being the seat in the way that we were talking about it before. It's like, oh, I can sit in myself and lead, as opposed to which is being self-led, which is it sounds like a very subtle distinction, but I think it makes the difference between there being, like this overarching kind of love versus just like loving versus hate. I think there's something that that encapsulates or includes both loving and hating, and it's neutral, like you said. But I think of it as a higher kind of love that the self possesses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, here's how I understand what you just said, and this may not reflect back what you meant, but so let's just see how close we are.
Mhm.
I'm hearing there are parts of me that can be loving,
Mhm.
and those parts can be loving because they're self-led, or those parts can be loving because loving's a great strategy to get what we want.
It's true too. Yeah.
So in other words, I can perform love
Mhm.
with an agenda to get what it is that I want or avoid what I don't want.
Right.
Or my state of being can be just loving. And in that state, that's evidence that I'm being self-led. And if while I'm being self-led and experiencing the state of love, being loving,
Mhm.
and I'm leading, that's going to be far more effective and far more attractive to those that might follow than someone that's performing being loving as a strategy to be a good leader.
For sure. For sure. Yeah.
Now, what I just said, how close does that come to what you meant?
No, I think it sheds light on a light that I wasn't even seeing on what I meant. So
Oh.
yeah, I think it's good. Yeah, I think the reason why, just to keep this practical, because I mean, what's the point otherwise, right? I don't want to be esoteric or abstract. Is there's a bottomlessness that I feel otherwise, and maybe that's the truth, is that there is no bottom, to the experience of the self. It just there are just selves, parts of self, and my way of thinking has been influenced to want to know that there is an experience that I have that is the bottom, like that's right, that's true always, and you can rely on, you can get there and you can rely on it, and it might be fleeting, the experience, but there's a difference between that and just a fix or a problem solved, or a temporary, that and there's nothing but those temporaries.
Right.
I think part of the difference is also one that we find between discussions between Buddhists and people of the theological traditions, right? The Buddhist says there is no bottom. There are just these parts, and so there is no bottom. It's just fragmented ultimately. And the theological schools say, well, there is something that contains all of those, and that's what we mean by the self.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that's very much influencing how I'm participating in this conversation.
From the more of the Buddhist view than the the latter.
The latter. Yeah.
I see. Okay. When you say let's keep this practical, I love that idea. I love examples of how, under the influence of a burdened part, I'm going to react differently to whatever's coming my way in life than if my parts are all self-led.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of factors that come into why I would show up as self-led or from a burden. For example, if I have diminished capacity because I don't have enough sleep, because I haven't got good nutrition, because I haven't been moving my body around enough, because I've had a recent loss. I mean, there's a million reasons why my capacity would be reduced.
Yeah.
And typically what uses up my capacity is the management of my internal world.
Mm-hmm.
If my parts are busy managing my internal world, then they don't have a lot of capacity left to be able to just relax and allow self-led parts to respond to the next thing that comes along that needs some sort of response.
Mm-hmm.
So this morning, before you and I joined together to record this, I was working on some writing. And in the writing, I had one part that continued to rise up and kind of shout for my attention. And going back to the seat of consciousness, that image from Bonnie Weiss's workbook. It's as if this frustrated and impatient part insisted on putting himself in that seat of consciousness and influencing my access to inspiration as I wrote. And so I finally had to slow down enough and pause, and this is something that I've been talking to my clients quite a bit about lately, is that the practical application of the IFS model is at least twofold. One like parallel path would be that we want to notice when our parts are activated and having an influence on us that's not helpful.
Mm-hmm.
And then tend to that part by pausing, acknowledging the influence, and getting curious with the part Now, we don't always have time to do that at the speed of life. So just pausing long enough to say to the part, hey, I see you, and I see that you've got a concern and that you want have some input here. I can take 5 minutes right now. Tell me, part, what is it that you're concerned about? What is it you want me to know and understand that has you continuing to show up? And then just pausing for 3-4 minutes and just waiting for an answer. And when that happens, sometimes a memory will come up. Or sometimes it'll be just as clear as can be. A billboard flashes before my eyes that says, here's what I want you to know. And then if I can just address that concern, whatever that is, then the part can relax. And when it relaxes, and this seems to be a universal truth that I'm finding using the IFS model, is that when my concerned parts relax, because I've addressed those concerns,
Yes.
then I now have access to that self-energy again. Inspiration, for example, when I'm writing.
Yeah.
So there's a practical application right there.
Yeah. That relaxed place in the middle. I mean, that I relate to that resonates very strongly for me. I'm going to make an analogy to bring out another practical level of this, if I could. It was in the design of our governmental system that there be the executive branch, the branch that executes the law, the legislative branch, the branch that makes the law to be executed, and then the justice system, right? The judicial branch. And the judicial branch decides in cases that aren't clear whether the law applies to a particular execution of the law. So we need those three to bring that still moment into view, right? If every execution is just as equal, like, you might think it's okay to do that, but I don't, but we have no way of deciding who's right. Well, then we live in a chaos, right? And so that's why the system was designed the way it is. And so in, my handling of my parts, if they're all, they're all just of equal value, then it feels chaotic to me. Like I could excuse myself here. I could say, well, that's just the way that part is, I could do this. But then I'm living a chaotic life and I don't really know, how to apply, my values or how to execute in a particular case. And so I'm for this distinction between parts and self because I think that the self is kind of like the judicial branch. It's the one that doesn't change, but decides the application of value in any particular case. And that just, it gives me a place to come home to know, like, okay, that was the right choice, as opposed to just in, another part that we had to give credence to, or, had to appreciate in some way.
Very well said. I really enjoyed and appreciated you laying that out that way. And yet, even it's the judicial function that determines this is what we're about. These are our values, whatever that is. A lot of that can be influenced by those parts of us that have experienced whatever we've experienced to get us to this point right now.
Yeah.
Parts often will concern themselves with our survival. That's their primary focus.
Primary purpose, yeah.
Without them, the self-energy that would have no place to manifest because there would be no physical body to manifest it. So our parts, which are also of the mind rather than of the body, help us in deciding what's best to do. It's just that when they get stuck with outdated information, the decisions that they make are misaligned and maladaptive. So when there are parts of us that are more healed, more self-led, more current than these other parts that are still maladaptive and misaligned,
Mhm.
If we can somehow enlist and enroll those parts of ourselves that are self-led to help the parts of ourselves that still need healing,
Yes.
that is the process that IFS employs to
Mhm.
heal and update parts so that we can become more and more aligned with current reality. And something that you said also pointed to a fear or concern that occasionally I experience, and I know that my clients do as well, and that is that life is too overwhelming. How in the world am I ever going to solve the problems that I'm faced with today?
Yeah.
And we could think of 30 examples in 30 seconds probably of how many overwhelming experiences any of us might be faced with.
Mhm.
What I've learned is that it's the wisdom that comes from the self energy that inspires and informs our response to those overwhelming experiences when the parts of us that are overwhelmed are somehow reassured that they can actually relax and step back and allow that wisdom from self to step in and offer that leadership and that guidance.
Mhm. Mhm.
That's what we're after. That's what we are trying to accomplish in the IFS model, is to help more and more and more of our parts trust and have experiences, consistent experiences with self energy,
Yeah.
so that they know that they're not alone. And the fact that they're overwhelmed only means that they're overwhelmed. It doesn't mean that the situation itself is overwhelming and that we don't know what to do with it.
Right. Right. Which reminds me, by the way, of the loving parent
Good,
you
okay.
analogy in ACA,
Yes.
which is a 12-step program that I'm in, adult children of alcoholics and dysfunctional families. And that's that super love that I'm talking about, because the loving parent recognizes times when the child or the children inside or the family members inside are being loving, and when they're being hateful, but loves them unconditionally.
Yes. Yes. When someone comes into IFS therapy goes to get supported by an IFS trained practitioner,
Mhm.
and they don't know anything yet about the internal family systems model, and they certainly don't know how to use it and apply it to themselves. They need help. So the practitioner or the therapist is going to be the guide for a while, and they're going to be doing two things with that client. They're going to be helping the client access their parts by recognizing them, recognize the influence of parts, and then also by gradually and eventually connecting with those parts and then getting information from the parts so that the parts can be understood and appreciated.
Uh-huh.
So that's one thing that the therapist or practitioner will do with a client, while at the same time modeling so that the client can learn how to do that for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
One
Mm-hmm.
of the great things about the IFS model is that this is a model that we not only can but must, really, if we're going to heal and if we're going to transform, it's on us individually to do whatever work is necessary to organize our internal world so that we can continuously heal more and more and more and more over time, even when we don't have a trained practitioner in front of us showing us how to do it.
I see.
So when someone comes in to IFS therapy or coaching, if they don't have a lot of access to self energy, they need to borrow the self energy of the practitioner
I see.
long enough to develop self energy for themselves.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
A first session might look like the exploration, for example, of a critical part. So client shows up to the first session, and the coach hears, or practitioner or therapist hears, the client speaking from a critical part that says, that's me. That's me. You can count on me to be late. I don't care how early I leave. I'm always going to be late. I don't know what it is. There's something wrong with me, basically.
Yeah.
So the therapist, the client, or the practitioner's listening. The coach is listening for that. Well, that's a part. That is a part that wants to somehow communicate something to accomplish something. And what's really cool to me as a coach is that I don't have to figure any of that out. I notice it, and then I feed it back to the client and say,
Yeah.
I'm noticing that I'm hearing what you're saying is that is you, that you're someone who is late. And I'm wondering if you'd be interested in getting to know the part of you that thinks that that's true and influences you to believe it, and then try to convince me of it. And then in that, whatever remains in the session, 45, 50 minutes in the session, an exploration of that part might reveal that critical part is so afraid that others are going to criticize my client that it tries to beat everybody else to the punch and criticize my clients so that they can correct themselves before they give anything to be criticized.
Yeah.
And in 45 or 50 minutes, if the client's open to it, they can recognize and realize, oh, this part is doing everything it knows how to do. It's completely unresourced. It has no other method other than to criticize me. And we might even discover where did this part learn how to be critical? Oh, I had a critical uncle. And that uncle was, every time I saw him, he was critical. So I was always very careful around him not to make any mistakes or take any risks. This part must have thought let's ask the part. Yep. The part says, yep, that's where I learned it. Uncle Joe taught me how to be critical. But look at how much I've protected. Yeah. You protected me. You have protected me. Thank you very much. And are you interested in learning a new way?
The recognizing, the getting to know the part, the recognizing that it has an origin and a purpose and all of that, and that it's ultimately, trying to do some good for me. The recognizing part, that's the self, right?
That actually requires the self energy to be able to do that.
Yes.
And interestingly, shifting, like that was a good example of borrowing the self energy of the coach or the practitioner who is curious, bringing self-energized curiosity. And as the practitioner or coach provides that, then that kind of wakes up the potential in the parts of, oh, I can do that too, can't I? I'm not accustomed to being curious. I'm more accustomed to being judgmental. But yeah, I kind of like how this feels. Let's try this. Yeah, I can be curious. Let's see if I can learn something about myself and about my fellow parts, my counterparts.
Beautiful.
Yeah. And that just continues and builds. That first part that got the attention, the loving, compassionate, curious, self-energized curiosity in that first session now might become the very first ambassador of self-energy for the rest of the system. And may just jump on its steed with its flag and go marching through the inward environment and say, hey, something cool's happening here. You guys want some of this?
Yeah.
And the whole system can begin to shift in that way. Self-energy. So notice as I shared that example, not once did I refer to a separate self that came in and rescued or saved the day.
Yeah, no, I never claimed that I was separate.
Oh, I know. I'm just really re-emphasizing the point that I was making earlier that because I guess I have this ongoing internal argument happening. Like, gosh, I read this in the IFS material, and I listen to some of the IFS trainers, and they're talking about self as if it's a separate entity or separate.
Yeah, well, I think
separate thing.
My impression, and I might be way off here, is that we have a hard time distinguishing without making separate. Like, how could it be distinct and not be separate? Well, I think that's entirely possible. I don't think there's a contradiction there. And that's one of the things that I consider of the nature of the self, is that it includes all. And so it includes what might seem contradictory, to a rational part of us. It would seem contradictory. Well, how could it be distinct and not be separate? Well, I think that's entirely possible. Like two people fighting for the same cause, but they're distinct people.
Well, and they might be using two distinct strategies to fight for that same cause.
Exactly.
Which is a great analogy, because that's exactly what's happening in the internal world.
Right, exactly, yeah.
Often protectors are taking on dramatically different strategies to accomplish exactly the same thing. You might have one part that's a critic to protect an exiled part that's holding the tender, vulnerable, painful, scary, hurtful stuff, energy. And so that critic is trying to manage all of that. And then there's a polarized part that wants the part to just completely be out there and prove to everybody just about how lovable they are. In some way.
Right, yeah.
And now they're at odds. They're completely at odds, those two parts.
This brings me back to, the theological traditions versus that, because there were a lot of people in my upbringing who rejected Christianity because they couldn't see how God could be distinct from us and yet not separate. And,
Yes.
that's that. I think it's the exact same issue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's a mystery. It occurs
And
as
so,
a mystery.
that's why you get people saying, well, I don't believe that, God's up there in heaven looking down on us, making judgments on us. And I was like, well, I don't either. Oh, well, then you don't believe in God. No, I do. He's distinct, but not separate.
Now, this is not what you're saying right now at all, but what you said reminds me of this, and it's worth mentioning. In one of my scrolling sessions on my iPhone, as I was just kind of at the end of my day, just trying to deaden my mind, I ran across a video of an interview with Viktor Frankl.
Oh,
And
wow.
The interviewer asked Viktor, "Do you believe in God?"
Mm-hmm.
First he said, "Did you believe in God when you were in the concentration camp?"
Mm-hmm.
And he said, "Yes, I did."
Mm-hmm.
"And now, do you believe in God all these years later?" "No." "Oh, what happened?" "Oh, I know God. No need to believe anymore."
I see. Awesome.
I thought that was one of the coolest things I've ever heard.
That's beautiful.
Well, I love that we've been talking about this today in kind of the scattered and kind of chaotic way that we have. We didn't have an outline, and we just kind of let the conversation dictate where we went next. And I want to extend an invitation, even a request to our listeners, that if this conversation has raised questions for you, if you would have been part of this conversation and had more to say that we didn't cover today, and that you'd like to hear us talk about, please email either me or Marty. You'll find our email addresses in show notes. If you have questions you'd like us to address, I don't know that we have any of the answers. Both of us are coaches, so we both have a lot of questions ourselves, but we certainly will discuss your suggestions of things that you'd like to talk about, whether it's related to the IFS model or any other aspect of the True You. Marty, anything else you want to say before we say goodbye?
No, it was good to be together.
I'll see you in episode 3. We appreciate who you are, that you would be listening to this podcast, and want to acknowledge all those parts of you that yearn for the experience of the True You.
If you like this episode, click like, share it with others, and be sure to subscribe. Listen again next week for the newest episode.
Check show notes for a transcript and a link to resources, including a link to let us know if you'd like to be a guest on our podcast.
Thank you for listening and going on this journey with us back to the True You.